Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Development of the Unified Standards System. Today's presentation will be recorded and sent out to all registered participants and also be posted on the Hub. We will have a Q&A portion throughout the presentation. You can type your questions into the question box on the webinar doc. We're glad to spend this time with you today. Now on to Trini with Textile Exchange. Trini?
Thank you, Rose. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. You will be hearing from three presenters, mainly Laura Kohler, our Standards Director. This is me, Trini, Standards Senior Manager. And then we will also hear from Stephanie Pokorski, our Claims Manager. In today's webinar, we are going to go through a couple of things. We're going to begin with a quick housekeeping update. Laura is going to run us through a little bit of background information about us as an organization, as well as about our team. And then the majority of time will be spent on the development of the unified standard system, touching on different points within the development process. And then we hope to have a little bit more time on the Q&A at the end. The first point I wanted to touch on is that we launched a Standard Stakeholders Hub community, which is a platform where basically everything standards can be discussed, where conversation is encouraged and facilitated. We will be able to answer questions via the Hub and also share resources back to those interested in standards. This community launched today. This webinar will also be posted to the Hub community, and we will also be posting questions and answers that have been asked today back to the Hub. There is a Q&A function at the bottom. As I mentioned, we hope to get to as many questions as we can, but rest assured we will be answering them after the webinar. And at that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Laura.
Great. Thank you, Trini. And hello, everyone. Welcome. This is an exciting day for me. So I'm Laura Kohler, and of course, the majority of you I have not met because I am fairly new to the organization. I started at the end of 2021. And a big reason that I came on board to lead our standards team is the unified standard development process that we're talking about today. So that's why it's particularly exciting for me. I wanted to let you all know that I have been working in sustainability standards and certification for quite a long time, really the majority of my professional career. Primarily, though, I've been working in forest products in the FSC system. That's where a lot of my experience comes, as well as with the Rainforest Alliance and the agriculture products that they have. But both of those are very similar in terms of running certification standards that are focused on impacts on the ground and being part of the ICL network. So what I want to do is just before I dive right into the unified standard is give you a bit of context and information organizationally from Textile Exchange, because standards are one of many tools that we have to inspire and equip via our mission and vision to provide actionable guidance and tools to the textile industry to be adopting preferred fibers and materials and looking for solutions and innovations to keep that progress moving forward. And this is information about it's presenting numbers, but also representing a variety of areas that we're involved in across the organization. So much broader than what we're doing in standards. So for example, we run several roundtables that are focused on different fibers and materials, bringing together in a non-competitive space different stakeholders who want to talk about innovation and areas to make progress on how to bring about more preferred adoption of preferred fibers and materials. So a couple of those roundtables are looking at man-made cellulosic fibers coming from forest products, for example, as well as recycled polyester, organic cotton. There are several different roundtables. Another tool that we have is our material change index that's used in a corporate benchmarking program. And that's a way for businesses to develop their strategies to increase their preferred fibers and materials within their supply chain. So I just wanted to mention and show, the variety of areas that we're inspiring and equipping in the textile industry. Then if I just give a snapshot right now of our certification standards in Textile Exchange, you can see the different standard logos along the bottom. So far, what we've been doing for the past 15 to 20 years is looking at different opportunities to get involved in responsible practices. It's pretty far reaching in terms of, looking at organic content in products, looking at what are acceptable inputs for our recycled standards, addressing animal welfare, and then foundational to all of the different standards and materials that we're working in is our chain of custody standard that we call the content claim standard. And so I just wanted to provide, before getting into what we're doing with the unified standard, a little bit more context of the different areas that we are already working. And I also want to mention the valuable team that we have behind all of this work. This is, of course, one of many teams in Textile Exchange, and also just one of a pretty wide range of staff that are contributing to the standard development in terms of bringing technical expertise across different fibers and materials, bringing an oversight mechanism through our assurance program. But this is, for now, letting you see who we are on the standards team, where we are based around the globe. I'm not going to go into each one of us, but these are different people that you have been seeing on presentations at the conference, in different meetings, and will continue to guide the process on the unified standard development. So for me, a very special thank you to this whole team for supporting the process. And then the next thing I want to say, many of you probably are paying attention to our news and participating in different discussions that we have where we have been emphasizing our organizational strategy around climate, and in particular, having a 2030 goal to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions that are happening in the textile industry by 45%. And specifically, that goal that we are looking at how to achieve that is focused on the raw material and producer level. So in the textile industry, that's often referred to as Tier 4. We're also looking at the very initial steps of production. So in terms of our focus on achieving the 45% reduction, those are the areas that we are focused and will be a big part of what I start to talk to you about as we get into the unified standard. And so with that, I am going to move into the main objective of what we're talking about today, which is the development of this standard system. And I wanted to stop here to just mention one important point, which is that, now for, I think, about a year, we've been referring to this process as the unified standard, but I want to make sure everybody knows that is not our intended branded name for the standard in the future. That is a separate process that we have to look at what type of name that we want to have that can go with the new standard system when we're ready to launch it. But for now, that is our holding name and the one that you will continue to see. So if you are in the hub or on our website and you are trying to remember where it is that we're providing this information, you can still look for it as the unified standard. Okay, so that brings us to my providing the summary information of what it is exactly that we're doing with the unified standard development. The first thing is we recognized quite a while ago that having 8 different standards that have each one kind of developed under its own objectives and processes and interests in terms of what are the challenges that we're addressing with those standards, that it would be very beneficial, not only for us internally and how we manage those standards, but also for all of the stakeholders who are participating in our program, whether it be certified sites or brands or the certification bodies. There's real benefit to everybody if we bring that under one harmonized system as best as we can. So that was something that we identified a while ago. At the same time, we were working organizationally on our Climate Plus goal and the impact that we want to have on climate, positive change on climate. And so it became very clear to us that as we embarked on this process to unify our standards under one system, we need to look at what are the opportunities to embed the Climate Plus impact areas, which you can see represented in the first 4 pillars on the screen to the left. We also have these additional key impact areas, starting with animal welfare, moving towards the right. So this represents, these are the 8 pillars of impact that we're addressing in the unified standard development. And in particular, that we're focused on the raw material producer level, as well as the first step in the supply chain. And you can see that on this slide. So like I had mentioned before, using the tier terminology in the textile industry, it's over here to the left that we are focused in what we're doing on looking at what are the opportunities to incorporate criteria type measurements on those key impact areas focused at the raw material stage and the first stages of processing. And then we have some areas that we're looking at in the rest of the supply chain, and what are some changes to the requirements that we have related to kind of non-chain of custody areas. So that is another area that we're looking at, but probably more in the optional category in terms of how companies will be evaluated against any of those new requirements. Okay, so another thing that I want to mention, because it could be on a lot of people's minds, is our content claim standard, the CCS. So for many of you, you're probably aware that we had gone through a revision process with that standard, and it was finalized 1 year ago and then becomes operational this month, actually. So it's important to note that the CCS is not being changed as part of the unified standard process. We're not planning another revision of the CCS at this same time. So the standard, besides some of the minor adjustments that might normally happen in a standard, otherwise it will remain as it is going forward, supporting all of the pre-existing fibers and materials that we're working in. Of course, the CCS, it is a basic fundamental foundation to any standard system, having chain of custody requirements that support the supply chain and tracking of material through that supply chain. So the CCS will remain in parallel to support the unified standard when it's ready in the future. And here is where I want to talk about the scope of fibers and materials that we have planned in the standard. Of course, everything that we've already been doing is included, and in the vision for the unified standard means that there will be certain fibers and materials that are recognized from each of these major categories that you see across the middle of the screen. And that means that we are looking at some new fibers and materials. We've gotten requests to fill gaps, bring consistency in terms of having a common set of requirements and language and claims and visual presence for certified materials. So we are, acknowledging those requests that have come to us. We've also identified in some cases there are areas that would bring real benefit to the Climate Plus goal that we have organizationally, and that we would like to look at those fibers and materials as well. So I'm not going to, at this point in time, go into detail of what those new materials are, because we're still in that exploratory phase of deciding yes or no, and then to what and how we will address those in the standard in the future. But you will see the man-made cellulosic fibers, latex, and biosynthetics. Those are new areas that we've already been talking about publicly and exploring. The other thing on this slide that I want to mention to everybody, because it is something that probably has popped into different people's minds, is, as we move into that raw material producer level of requirements, that's new for us in some areas. So in particular on the natural fiber crops. So far, we've been working in tracking organic content, but we are looking at the farm level now in terms of opportunities on the Climate Plus goal. But we also want to recognize that there are pre-existing standards already out there that are moving in the same direction that we are in terms of driving positive impact on the ground, looking at ways to get involved in positive climate change. So we don't want to come into a space where we are duplicating the efforts that are already there, adding another layer of audits and certification into the industry. So we are, as part of the unified standard process, also looking at an equivalency recognition program where we can do a benchmarking of other standards that we deem are moving in that same direction, check how aligned we are, and establish partnerships to be able to have a recognition of those pre-existing standards within our system. So I just wanted to make sure everybody is also aware of that initiative that is running in parallel to the unified standard process. A bit of background for everyone is that with all of our standards, because we are an ICEAL member and are committed to having a multi-stakeholder, representative, and transparent process, each of our standards has a life cycle. And that applies whether it's a standard we already have operational or when we're developing a standard for a new area that we haven't had before. So on the left, you can see what is the typical life cycle of a standard, where we identify that there are certain challenges that we would like to address through establishing best practices that will drive positive change. You develop a standard around those best practices. The standard is finalized and implemented in the field. As it's implemented, we are all learning about the value of that standard, the value that it brings, as well as any of the risks and challenges with implementing the standard. So we take that information into consideration and open up a revision process. And in that revision process, we establish an international working group. So this is a group of representatives that you will see on the right side of the screen coming from different parts of the world to bring, important cultural and regional perspectives on the requirements, looking at different industries that are working in the standards, and then also different expertises and specialties coming from civil society. So that's the construct of a working group that guides the process of either standard development or standard revision. So in the case of the unified standard, we do have an international working group that has already convened, that we've been holding regular active discussions with on different areas that we're working on in the standard. And a very special thank you to the working group, because it goes without saying that they dedicate quite a lot of their time to participate in the process, often, having to join meetings at unusual hours because it is an international working group across many different time zones, needing to review information that we're sending to them in advance and be active participants. So it is an incredible contribution that working group members dedicate to the process. So additionally, in the unified standard, I wanted to talk about, how are we working towards the content that we plan to develop in the standard? And this is something, different and unique in terms of how we're looking at these 8 key impact areas that are repeated across the top of the screen. So for each one of those, we have to understand, first on the climate side of things, how are they interrelated in terms of how they're contributing towards the greenhouse gas reduction goal that we have, how they're related in terms of practices on the ground. We are opening up a process with the right expertise in place to develop what are going to be the indicators that represent that there is positive change that's happening, and what are the desired outcomes that we want to see over time. So that's kind of an initial groundwork that we need to lay to understand how that's going to translate into the unified standard. And I will say that process of identifying indicators and outcomes that are going to have a desired lasting impact on the ground contributes to other tools that we have in the organization. So that process is not only intended for a standard and certification context, but a variety of other tools that we're providing to the industry. But in terms of the unified standard, a big, result of that process is identifying the best practices that we consider are going to be important to see on the ground at that raw material level, as well as, like I mentioned, the first stage of processing. From those best practices, then we start to look at what is the right type of standard content that we need to develop. And so on one side, over to the left, you see the practice-based criteria. This is what, any of you already working in our standards, this is what you're familiar with. This is the normal construct, the traditional way that standards are presented with practice-based criteria, which are requirements that are evaluated for conformance. In some cases, criteria are identified as being critical, meaning that that particular requirement shall be met in order for the certificate to be issued and maintained when it's evaluated in future audits. Sometimes the practice-based criteria result in nonconformities that can be graded as either major or minor and have certain actions and timelines that apply. So we will still have our traditional practice-based criteria in the standard, but what's new for us in terms of where we think that we can have the most positive results on the key impact areas is looking at outcome-based criteria and checkpoints. And a lot of the sustainability standards are moving in this direction, becoming a hybrid model where they incorporate both the traditional practice-based requirements as well as outcome-based checkpoints. The key difference here in terms of practice moving to outcomes, in our first version of the standard, we want to carefully identify what are the baseline measurements that we want to take that are related to the impact areas. So getting that baseline information, recording that, checking it again each time we go out and do an audit and through other tools that we may collect data and information, bringing that data back into a monitoring and evaluation system. So recording it in a way that is meaningful and viable for us to be able to extract that data, monitor it, analyze it, understand where we need to maybe refine information, where it's a great opportunity to demonstrate continuous improvement, where we can take that information and feed it back to the participants in the system so they can understand that as their practices are changing, evolving, and improving over time, the benefit that that's bringing and how that's delivering on the climate goal that we have, not only in textile exchange, but across the whole textile industry. So that is kind of a whole other area just to really bring this kind of full circle on what we're doing with the Climate Plus and other key impact areas is looking for that evolution in our standard to incorporate an outcome-based future forward approach. All right, so that brings us to the timeline of the unified standard development. And of course, the flag right about in the middle there is where we are today with this webinar. So before today has really been about laying the groundwork, identifying, the need that we had to harmonize our different standards under one system, identifying the opportunity that we have to address our Climate Plus goal through standards, and then understanding what does that look like? What's the scope of the standard? What are the different issues that we should be exploring, unpacking, discussing? So all of that groundwork has been laid. And then starting in May, we kicked off our international working group. And at the same time, started putting together what we call issue papers. So those are all of the key challenges and opportunities that we want to take into consideration for the standard, looking into each one of those through its own sort of exploratory process, taking that information back to the international working group to have an open discussion, hear their feedback, understand any red flags that they raise, as well as ideas for the path forward, and take that information that we're learning, through both the issue paper and those working group discussions and move to the next phase. Does that mean that we continue to explore that topic, bring in additional experts, and how does that result in the actual development of the standard? And so in terms of starting to write the criteria for the standard and/or looking at pre-existing criteria that we've already had, and where do we need to revise those requirements, that process is looking at the fall timeline this year, so starting in September. And so then we'll be kind of running in parallel in terms of actually writing standard content, continuing to explore those issue paper discussions with the working group. But all of that leading up to an important milestone for all of you, which is the open stakeholder consultations in 2023. So we are aiming to have the first draft standard shared publicly for stakeholder input in the first quarter of 2023. We don't have a specific date yet. Of course, there's a lot of things that need to happen before then, but sometime in that first quarter is our goal. Because this is such a major process that we're undertaking, not only a revision of pre-existing standards, but incorporating new areas, we think it's really important to have a second stakeholder consultation. So what we'll do is take all of the learnings and feedback and review that information after the first consultation, make revisions to that draft standard, and then put out a second draft sometime over the summer of 2023 to collect more feedback before we finalize the standard. So the goal for the whole process is to publish the standard before the end of 2023. So that's why we have quarter 4 highlighted on here. So that's when everybody will be able to see what is the final outcome of this whole process, what's the final set of requirements that we've included in the standard, and the accompanying systems that go with that, such as the recognition and benchmarking that I mentioned. And I want to also mention in relation to the timeline that in our system, there are many, many different participants, hundreds of thousands of participants actually. And so it's important to allow all of those impacted parties to have time to digest the new standard, look at how they need to adjust their systems, prepare for that. So we always allow a 1-year implementation period before a standard becomes effective and required to be implemented. So even though we'll publish the standard at the end of 2023, it will really be the end of 2024 or, likely January 1st, 2025, that the new unified standard system is effective and operational. And for some, that might sound like a really long timeline, and for others that it's way too short. I've heard both, and I can understand both sides of that consideration. But one thing I do want to say is we want to make sure and have this implemented as soon as feasible in a responsible manner, because we really do need to start collecting that information towards the Climate Plus goal that is set for 2030. So the timeline we have will allow that 5-year period for the standard to be in implementation and collecting the right data to be learning from. So one thing, I'm shifting gears here, and this is an area that we have Christina from our team that she is overseeing, and I'm going to go through the content here, just taking one of the fiber areas that we're working in and providing a bit more information, and one that I think is, of particular interest for people, that we want to make you aware of our fiber crops module and a process that we've been working on for the past couple of years and have just within the last couple of weeks kicked off more formally in a public way. To give a bit of the background, we were gifted a sustainable fiber program standard from Control Union that opens up a new area for us in terms of looking at farm level cotton production practices on the ground, and how can we work in best practices at that farm level. We, again, kind of like this decision to create the unified standard across our 8 different standards, the timing of this synced up nicely with the Climate Plus strategy that we have. And so it became very clear to us that we needed to work on these 2 efforts together. So how can we take that sustainable fiber program and move it in the same direction as our Climate Plus strategy? And that's what's formed for us today, the fiber crops module. And you'll see that over to the right and mentioned here, this is bringing back the relevance to today's discussion, that there are going to be learnings in this module that will directly feed into the unified standard development. We also have an impact incentives program that a lot of you may be aware of. So that is also a big part of what we're looking at with the fiber crops module. So our objectives in this module are to look at what are the farm level practices that are going to be moving in the same direction that we need to have positive impact on the Climate Plus outcomes across those areas in terms of soil health, use of water resources, and increasing biodiversity within those farm systems. And those are the different areas where we want to know what are the best practices. So identifying best practices, testing those in the field, learning from the data and other information that we're measuring and collecting through this field level pilot process. And so that's the other thing that's important to note here, that I had said that within the last couple of weeks, we've shifted to a more public announcement about the fiber crops module, and that's through a call for participants in the pilot program. The pilot right now is focused on cotton. What we take and learn from this pilot will help contribute to other crops that we're considering for hemp and flax. I want to mention for the fiber crops module that right now is an opportunity for participants at the farm level, as well as program partners that are already working with farm groups or that would like to sponsor farm groups, to take a look at the information for the pilot. We want to get participants from different regions around the world to really look at this in well-rounded, holistic way and learn from farm practices that are happening in different parts of the world. It's also an opportunity for funding. So any brands and other groups out there that have an interest in providing funded benefit to provide incentives to producers on this journey of linking their best practices to positive climate change. So if you would like information, more information about this, you can see Christina's email on the slide, and you can reach out to her. Also, of course, if you look up the information in the hub or on our website, you'll also find links to the fiber crops module. And with that, I'll take a bit of a break from my talking and let Stephanie take over and walk you through what we're also looking at for claims and labeling connected to the unified standard.
Great, thanks, Laura. So yeah, I am Stephanie Pokorski, and I'm our standards claims manager. And today I feel like I have a super exciting job of telling you all that we are actually now in the process of developing a new logo or logo system to accompany the unified standard. So at this point, we've partnered with a design agency in early June and have already hit the ground running with this work. So you can go to the next slide. Yep. To back up for one moment, I wanted to share a little context about our current logos and our thinking around labeling for the unified standard. As most of you know, some of our logos are similar in terms of shape or the style of them, especially the animal fiber related logos, but for the most part, they are not part of a more cohesive brand. And of course, that has been challenging, not only internally for us to manage all of these different logos, but for brands and companies like many of you who are looking to label their products or communicate about more than even just one of our standards. So using all of these different standards that aren't part of a cohesive brand is very challenging for many reasons. So below the standards logos that we're looking at here is a very simple mock-up of how an on-product certification mark could be set up under the unified standards system. The mark itself, we're hoping, will be very simple and clear. Of course, not as simple as what we're looking at here with nothing in it at all. But we're really looking to not lead to any confusion. So keeping that very clear in the actual mark itself. And then, of course, outside of the mark, we have the opportunity to share the other qualifying information about the product certification. So the material or the actual specification of what that is, organic or recycled, what have you. So overall, the look we're going for is simplified from what we have now, and hopefully it'll be easier to work with. And I will also just note here that while we have a lovely new branding for Textile Exchange that I think all of you have seen and enjoyed by now, we are, for a few different reasons, looking to create an identity for the unified standard that is a bit different from our current organizational brand. We're still looking to pull elements of this brand into the visual identity for the standard, but since these logos are consumer facing, it's a different kind of a different look that we're going for. So we'll see how we can pursue that with the agency we're working with. You can go to the next slide. So over the past year or so, we have been gathering feedback from a variety of different brands and retailers and other companies that are using our logos. And we actually have a group of companies who make up what we call a labeling task force that are helping us think through labeling and other related topics. So the feedback we received was actually very similar across all of the companies. So a lot of companies felt that the current logos are too restrictive in their current state, and without having more flexibility in terms of color and size, for example, they're finding it very challenging to use them properly. The logos, for various reasons, don't have much recognition in the market, although some of them have more than others, and that's simply because a lot of brands have put a lot of effort into promoting them, which we're very appreciative of. However, because there are so many different logos in our system right now, it makes it much more challenging to market them and tell a more connected story about our standard system as a whole, or even individually. And finally, of course, it's very difficult to label individual products that are certified to multiple standards. So for example, a product containing OCS cotton and GRS certified polyester together, right now would require 2 different logos and various statements and different qualifying information. So these are, yeah, some of the bigger challenges that we've been hearing about and are really looking forward to tackling in the new development of the logos going forward. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so this slide has a lot going on and I won't talk through all of it, but it represents at a high level the timeline and the process we will be going through with a design agency to develop the new logo system for the unified standard. As I mentioned before, we kicked off this work actually at the end of May. And up until now, we have been supporting the agency's team in understanding everything about our current system for standards and logo use and really everything in between, making sure they're fully immersed and well aware of everything that's going on. And at this point, they've been conducting stakeholder interviews with many people in the industry. So across not only our internal team, but many brands and retailers, maybe some of you listening in today are participating in those interviews, supply chain members, as well as producers and even other subject matter experts who have knowledge of claims and labeling systems for certification schemes. So we're trying to pick everybody's brains, and they're really doing a lot of work to gather all that information and take a look at a broad range of information and perspectives from the industry. There may also be some opportunities for others to participate in giving feedback and thoughts in this process. And if those come up, we'll definitely share that opportunity probably through the standards stakeholder hub community. So it would be great if you all join that, and so you can hear about progress in this and any opportunities to give feedback. But following the analysis of the interviews and other immersion materials and activities that we're conducting, or the design agency's team is conducting, their team will present an initial creative brief, which will not only include rudimentary concepts for the logo design, so kind of wireframes or outline concepts for how it could be mocked up, but they're also going to be presenting some different naming options for the unified standard. So as Laura mentioned, we will not officially call this a unified standard or trademark it as that name. So they're going to help us think through what we can actually call it, which is going to be super helpful. So at that point, when we have some of this more established thoughts and proposals, we'll convene our labeling task force again to explore all of it together. And it will kind of be a back and forth process from that point between the agency and us, plus the task force, and again, any opportunities for external feedback from anybody who's not part of the task force at this time. And once we settle on a way forward, we will spend time fine-tuning the concepts for the logo system and the name, and work towards, of course, trademarking both of those and having a final package of a name and logo or logos by the end of this year. So it's not on the same exact timeline as the unified standard. We'll wrap up a fair bit earlier, but even though we'll finish by the end of the year, we likely will not be releasing or sharing these logos publicly at that time, and we'll probably wait until the launch of the unified standard at the end of 2023 to publish everything as a package together. And of course, alongside the release of the logos, there will be a generous transition period policy for implementing the use of the new logo. So you won't have to switch over immediately to the new logos and get rid of everything that you're using right now with our current logos. There will definitely be a transition period for that. And so, yeah, we're very excited about this work, and I know it's kind of long overdue, but the unified standard has presented a really great opportunity to start fresh with our labels and create something that's useful and credible for the industry. And that's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. I think that was really valuable information to share with everybody, because the two initiatives obviously go hand in hand. We weren't going to be able to launch the unified standard system and keep those same pre-existing different logos that apply to each of the standards that we have right now. So it's good for everybody to be aware of this early in the process and be on the lookout for information that we share as we progress. So there's one last bit of information that I just want to make sure, because it's again something that I thought, well, this might be popping in people's minds and important to let all of you know what's happening with Trackit at the same time, or how it's impacted by the unified standard system. And then, so this will be the last bit that I share before we look at how you can participate more, stay engaged, and ask some questions. So well, the main thing I want to say about Trackit is that it's not going to be impacted directly while we're developing the unified standard system. It will stay on its pre-existing timeline and set of goals for its development. It's something that's been happening over time, and I'm sure many of you have participated in other meetings to learn about its development. And I know that there has been a lot of outreach to Yvonne, who is our person leading this process, and engaging with her on questions in her data and technology team to make sure everybody is on this, up to speed on what Trackit is. It is an enterprise data platform that we are in the process of developing, and right now also testing with some of the certification bodies, that is aiming to centralize our audit and certification data that is collected in relation to the standards. So the objectives of having this shared data platform, or a centralized data platform, is to be able to reconcile volume data that's being collected as part of the audit process. We want to prevent duplication of information and having to find information, across different sources. It's being developed to have a mechanism to trace certified material. And, most importantly is that it needs to be a single place to be able to authenticate scope certificate and transaction certificate information. So as you can see, it's a hugely beneficial tool that we are in the middle of developing. So it is going to stay on its same track. So kind of like I had mentioned about what's happening with the CCS and our chain of custody requirements, those are not impacted by the unified standard development. They remain in parallel. That's the same thing that what's happening with Trackit. Trackit is directly connected to our CCS system and will stay on that same track. In terms of that means it will be there to support the unified standard when we roll that out. And in that regard, it means also there will be some adaptations of Trackit when we have the unified standard, because we're moving in some of the fibers and materials to new areas, particularly farm level, that will have data that's collected at that raw material level that will be incorporated in Trackit. And then other data points that we identify are going to be important to record and track within the supply chain will be added over time as well. And you can all see here that there are two sides to the Trackit system. There's the digital Trackit, that's what's being tested right now in terms of centralizing the scope certificate and transaction certificate data. And then we are also developing for future implementation the e-Trackit system. And that's an additional option that will be available to enhance traceability using electronic tokens. So that's something that is still under development and more to come at a later date. I know, many participants in our system are very eager to have that technology available, and it's not getting waylaid by the unified standard. So I wanted to make sure everybody was aware of that. Okay, so the last bit here is just to make sure that everybody is aware of the different ways that you can stay informed and updated about where we are in the process, checking when we're looking to collect feedback from you, So we will provide high-level updates in the organization-wide Textile Exchange newsletter. This is the first point that you can see here, where there is a URL that you can go and sign up if you're not getting that newsletter. We also have a standards-specific newsletter, and I believe we have quite a lot of people already signed up for that have expressed an interest in keeping, staying engaged on standards as a whole. But if you're not signed up for that quarterly newsletter, you can see the standards at email there to reach out and get signed up for that. We mentioned at the beginning about the standard stakeholder hub community that's just gone live today. That will be, I think, the most informative and up-to-date way that will keep people informed about where we are and be able to respond to questions there. When we go to the public consultations, of course, we will put announcement out in these different platforms that I'm mentioning, as well as in the hub members portal. So we'll make sure to get the word out as broadly and intensively as possible when we open up those public consultations in 2023. We also, within the Textile Exchange website, have a page that is dedicated to what we're doing on the Unified Standard. On that page, so you see the web URL at the bottom, we also talk a bit more detail about the process, the objectives of the standard, and also the international working group. We are listing the organization names of IWG members on that webpage if you want to go and take a look there. And I guess with that, I can move to Trini supporting the open Q&A that we have.
Thank you very much, Laura. And I also wanted to mention, Taylor just put the links of the last slide that you saw in the chat, but also a reminder that you will receive the complete slide deck. So you can also revisit the slides there. In terms of questions, everybody feel free to type in your questions into the Q&A box. And I want to pull out a few that we have also answered already. One question was whether there will be an update on the GRS and the RCS before the unified standard development.
Okay, so for the recycled standards, we had conducted an initial open feedback session last summer. So we have that feedback in place to take into consideration with the unified standard. So the timeline process and goal that we have means that the changes we make to the recycled standard level requirements will be part of the unified standard. So we will not work separately on those standards and roll those out at a different timeline. It's going to become, or it is now already, one and the same process, and that we are taking into consideration the feedback already collected. And then, of course, when we go to the open consultation, you'll get more information there, and of course can reach out in the meantime.
Perfect. Thank you, Laura. Then we had another question around slide 22. Can you give an example of practice-based criteria versus outcome-based checkpoints for better understanding?
Yeah, so I think like an example that I like to use, which is probably for me because of my past experience and where I've seen this implemented, if we were looking at use of fertilizers on farms, practice-based criteria would set restrictions in terms of, let's say, having a list of prohibited fertilizers that shall not be used. And so the requirement would be very clear about, organization or farm shall not use fertilizers listed on the banned list. And then the auditor would go and check records, check fertilizers on site, interview workers, trying to determine that or confirm that those banned fertilizers are not in use. An outcome-based approach related to fertilizers may identify that there are certain practices happening today that need to change and improve over time. So there would be baseline measurements taken related to the type of fertilizers that are being used. We would have information on fertilizers that need to be restricted and omitted from the practices over time, and look at a method for continuous improvement to ensure that those fertilizers are no longer used. Also taking related measurements per fertilizer use. So what's the impact that's actually happening on the ground as those fertilizers move out of the production system? So it's just, it means that it's taking a more comprehensive and holistic look at those practices and measuring progress over time and learning from that.
Great, thank you, Laura. Another question we received is if we have an idea yet, if there will be a specific standard for in-conversion cotton as part of the unified standard system world.
So in-conversion cotton is one of the topic areas that we are exploring. So right now, I don't have any information that I'm able to share because it's in that exploratory phase. And so we're hoping that by the time of, at minimum or at latest, that first open draft consultation, we'll have information to share then. But just be aware that it is an important topic that we're taking into consideration and exploring in terms of what's going to be the best way to address in-conversion cotton or organic in the future.
Great. We probably have time for one more question. I think I'm going to pull the one around the track-it system on how information sharing will work between accreditation bodies and textile exchange. And the answer here is that basically in order to receive the data from the track-it system, the entity must be registered or be part of our chain of custody. And it is the certification bodies that will be responsible for submitting their own information to the accreditation bodies. And with that, we just want to give a reminder that any questions that are coming in now will be answered on the Hub community. And I'm handing it back to you, Laura.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. I hope that we've kept it dynamic and interesting to keep your attention. I will say I got through my content much faster than I expected. So that means there probably were some key points that I forgot to say. And that's a reason why it's really important to stay engaged, check the Hub, learn more. This is a really big process for us. It's a really exciting change that we have organizationally and in terms of focusing on our Climate Plus as a North Star and looking at the best and most meaningful way that we can incorporate that into a standards context. So it's going to be very nice to hear back from many of you about your questions, your ideas. It's all information that helps us learn in the process. And I really appreciate that you were here to listen. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you to our speakers, and thank you for participating in today's webinar. Please note the links shared in the chat, as well as knowing that if you have continued questions, you can join us in the Hub to ask questions or continue the conversation. Also, a friendly reminder that an email will be sent to all registered participants with a link to today's presentation. That concludes our webinar. Thank you. Goodbye.